Okay, in this video I want to deal with the two main reasons why people say there's no need to abolish the sex industry. The first is about reform, saying that if the sex industry was run differently there wouldn't be a problem. The second is a relative perspective, saying that although the sex industry is not a great job, neither is cleaning toilets or working on a building site. In other words, a lot of jobs just are alienating and degrading, but that's part of the trade-off we make for the benefits of living in an advanced industrial society, compared, say, to living in a mud hut where you could hand-weave your own clothing. Well, I think I can disprove both those claims based on one simple idea, that there will always be something essential to the sex industry which makes it a uniquely malignant force in society. The sex industry is about selling alienated sex, so instead of two people getting it on, there's a guy on his own looking at a woman on a screen, and the big difference there is the lack of emotional interaction. By the way, I realise that men get used in porn as well as women, but to keep it simple I'm going to refer to her or she. And again, for the sake of simplicity, I'm using porn as my example of commercialised sex. But even when a man visits a prostitute and the two of them are in the same room, there's still a total lack of emotional interaction. But the thing is, human sexuality is hardwired to work in terms of mutual interaction. And the reason for this is very simple if you think about evolution. Basically, any caveman who was happy to sit around all day fiddling with himself instead of going out and finding a mate was never going to do very well in terms of passing on his genes. So even our mind-numb porn punter feels the lack of this emotional interaction and has to find a substitute for it. But in the case of alienated sex, the only substitute available is control. He can rewind the video and repeat his favourite bit. He can choose Korean or Japanese girls, big tits, small tits, whatever. So he replaces mutual interaction with control, which is a kind of interaction, but one where her response is expressed in terms of displaying distress or pain. Also, control sets up a negative feedback loop, because the more he controls her actions, the less she's able to act spontaneously, so any element of freshness drains out of the experience. And then, to compensate for this decline, he has to be even more controlling. In contrast, with a genuine interaction, just someone touching your hand can be thrilling over and over again, because each time it's potentially a fresh experience animated by the excitement of actually connecting with another person. With porn, what used to be exciting soon becomes boring, leading to the desire for more control, which by definition means he needs to violate more of her boundaries. In other words, he needs to become more abusive and sadistic, because her pain or distress is the one thing his numbed senses can still register and get excited by. So now he needs to seek out exactly those activities which he doesn't want to perform as a way to express his control over her. So he might start off watching a woman giving a guy a blowjob, but this soon becomes boring and he needs a little extra. But that extra is never about seeing more foreplay or more human tenderness, because that aspect of sexual interaction is by definition not open to him. So he goes from watching her blow one guy to having to do it with two, then four, then they all come in her face, and then, eventually, he gets to what must be the most abusive act devised by man so far, ATM, or arse to mouth. That's right, she gets fucked up the arse and she has to take it in the mouth straight afterwards. And there we have it, pure sadism. Because there isn't an extra element of eroticism in ATM, it's just sadism and degradation ramped up to the max. Now, obviously not every guy is watching ATM on his computer, but it's still true that porn and commercialised sex in general can only push people in one direction, towards sadism. And fair enough, each individual will travel that road at a different speed, which could include a very slow drift towards sadism, but it is a one-way street. No one ever started off with dirty sluts do anal and ended up looking at tasteful pictures of half-naked girls in a cornfield. So anyway, that inevitable drive towards sadism is what disqualifies both of the justifications given for the sex industry. Firstly, it can't be reformed, exactly because of that sadistic drive. So, even though it would in theory be possible to create brothels which were totally safe and hygienic, that wouldn't stop the psychological damage that alienated sex will always do to anyone who gets involved with it. And you couldn't even minimise that by having a brothel which only catered for vanilla sex, because that would never be able to compete with the more gonzo establishment. So, what about the second justification? No, sex work is not just another unpleasant job. The difference being that most unpleasant jobs, like say working on a building site, could potentially be changed into a job that a person felt good about doing. For example, I used to work as a bricklayer in a building co-op, and I actually enjoyed that most of the time. However, Being a sex worker will always and inevitably involve degradation, no matter how it's organised. The same could perhaps be said about cleaning toilets, but the point is that we could change society so that unpleasant but necessary work like that was done by machines. Or, if that wasn't possible, it could be converted into a duty that every citizen did for 1 week a year. True, there are some jobs, like working at a nuclear power plant, which could never be made safe. But these are a small minority of jobs, and like the sex industry, they're not actually necessary, so they too could be abolished. So there you go. That's why I want to live in a world without commercialised sex. And finally, it's maybe worth pointing out that although the sex industry does most damage to the people it uses as objects, it's also a really bad deal for the paying punters. Constant exposure to porn has already reduced a lot of men in this society to the sexual equivalent of sad train spotters who can only relate to women in terms of numbers. Seeing her do it in 2 different positions must be better than just one, so imagine how great it would be to see her do all 10. Yeah, collect the full set. But there's an analogy with food here, where 1 slice is never enough, neither is 2, and 10 just makes you feel sick. The problem here is that the thrill has been made external to the actual experience. So in the end, the best thing about watching nuns with big tits is that you can brag about it afterwards to your mates and hear them saying, yeah, that must have been really hot. Except it's not. The experience itself is empty and numb, and just leaves you wanting more, but not in a good way. In this context, it's telling that the sex industry is now trying to overcome the contradiction at the heart of its product by including even more phony interaction. This explains why live video is the fastest growing format in porn. The extra being that the punter can now email in instructions such as turn round, take your blouse off or whatever. Then the woman does what he says and pretends she's enjoying it. But the thing is, it's also obviously fake and desperate that it just makes the whole event even more depressing and pointless. And this was summed up by one I saw where a punter emailed in, give us a smile. Doesn't that just show how pathetic our modern world of alienation has become? You've got this human being who, despite being trapped in his addiction to porn, still feels the need for some sort of emotional contact. But the only way he can reach for that is by sending an email to some poor woman in a room on an anonymous industrial estate, who then pretends to respond as if she was involved in the kind of genuine erotic encounter which has long ago ceased to exist. So people, come on, let's not allow our world to be dragged towards that very sad and degrading dystopia.